All right, this lecture is going to focus on the structures and powers of Congress, as well as looking at the leadership of Congress and kind of how they've divided that power amongst the parties and amongst the two sides of the bicameral legislature. First and foremost, this isn't necessarily important, but I do just they might ask a question about, one multiple choice question about the qualifications for Congress. So I wanted to get this information to you. The House, a minimum of 25 years old, and you have to be a citizen for 7 years. And most of the time, um, well, that's coming later. Senate is a minimum of 30, and the citizen must be a citizen for 9 years. And you do have to live in the state in which you are going to be elected. Some states may have a law about how long you've lived in that state. But most you do have to live and reside within that state that you're going to represent. Based on this, the Senate is going to be a lot more, seasoned or experienced people, the representatives, than maybe the House, and the fact that they can be a little bit younger. Most of the time, they're not going to be that age, but they did set that age at the founding of our country, and really hasn't changed much ever since. There are two differences, or a lot of differences, between the House and the Senate. First of all, the size. The Senate is obviously 100 people, and the House is 435. And because of that size difference, there is a need for stricter rules in the House of Representatives than in the Senate when it comes to debate. So debate in the House is going to see timed speeches. It's going to be very regimented in terms of how the debate is done. And then in the Senate, it's going to be a little bit less rules oriented and a little bit more process oriented. So you will see the difference there, and we'll talk about that more when we get into the legislative process in a couple of days. But overall, the size alone makes it have a difference in terms of how it functions. And then ultimately, you have a difference in prestige as well. The House of Representatives, and really, it it's almost as if if I asked you to name a representative, most of you could name at least one, probably a senator. But if I asked you to name a person in the House of Representatives, it'd be very difficult for some of you. And that shows you the prestige. The Senate, you're there longer, you're in the national spotlight longer, you're there for a 6 year term, not a 2 year term. So there isn't going to be as much turnover in the Senate as there is in the House. Not that there's a lot there either, but the Senate is more prestigious in that sense because you're there for a longer amount of time. If you could you may want to pause this and jot down some of the differences here. I'll talk about a couple of these in terms of the difference between the House and the Senate, but you'll need to know some of this, especially when talking about policy making. For example, the House of Representatives has a narrower constituency. Our representative right now is currently Congressman Thomas Massey, and he is responsible for much of northern Kentucky. So Boone, Kenton, Campbell, Grant, Pendleton. I think he might go all the way down to Mason County, but he is not responsible for any of the issues that are happening in Louisville right now. Any of the Black Lives Matter stuff that's going on, he's not necessarily going to be responsive to that. He could be, but his constituency and the people that he is responsible to most is Northern Kentucky and the needs of Northern Kentucky. However, over in the Senate, it is a much broader constituency because you're talking about somebody who is representing the entire state. So it is going to be in the interest of Mitch McConnell and Rand Paul, our two senators, to pay attention to issues that are happening in Jefferson County, as well as issues that are happening in Northern Kentucky. And in fact, if you've watched any of the recent videos of the 2020 senatorial election, Amy McGrath is even putting things out about the bridge in Northern Kentucky and how that's an issue for us. But then she's also going to have to go down into other areas and have different ads talking about specific things for the state as a whole. In the House, you have less media coverage. You have more media coverage in the Senate. And again, that's because those representatives are only guaranteed to be there for 2 years, whereas in the Senate they can actually have a little bit more in terms of more time and a little bit more opportunity to develop those relationships with media members. So the Senate is going to have much more media coverage in that sense. And the House here is seen as a little bit more partisan because you are there for 2 years and only 2 years. You're going to have to kind of stay in line with the party because in 2 years you're going to need that party to give you some funding for your campaign. Um, so the Senate is going to be a little less partisan because it's going to be more likely for a senator to flip on a vote for and vote based on a particular issue instead of actually voting for their party line. Now, obviously, we can see that today that partisanship has really increased in both sides, but there's more of a likelihood of crossing over in the Senate than there is going to be in the House of Representatives. I don't ask that you know all of these, but I do want you to just be aware of some of them. And as I said, we will talk about these throughout this unit of the differences between the House and the Senate in different contexts, whether it be the legislative process or oversight or anything like that. We will discuss the Rules Committee, but basically it's one extra step that happens in the House of Representatives that does not necessarily happen in the Senate. And I do want you to note this part right here. The Rules Committee is the most powerful in the House. That is a multiple choice question they like to ask from time to time. So it is a point to know. Basically, when a bill passes committee and it's getting ready to go onto the floor of the House, it then has to go to the Rules Committee. And the Rules Committee is going to set the parameters for debate. It's going to say how it can be amended, how the bill can be considered, and any special rules that might take place for that specific bill. So the Rules Committee, because of that, because of the way that they can set the rules, they can make it easier or harder for a piece of legislation to actually pass the House, thus making the Rules Committee the most powerful. We will talk about that more in the legislative process. So I don't want to necessarily go into too much right now, but I do want to give you some insight into that. There are three other functions of Congress as well that people tend to forget. The first thing that I do want you to remember is always remember that Congress makes laws. If you haven't written that down, Congress makes laws. Please write down that Congress makes laws. And the reason that I say that is if there's ever any FRQ or short answer that has anything to do with a power that Congress has over a certain issue, 98% of the time, one of the acceptable answers is that Congress makes laws. Because there's such a focus on the legislative process, we tend to forget that there are other needs for or other powers and functions of Congress, and one of those is oversight. Oversiight's another big one, and I would definitely know this one as well. Basically, the job of Congress is to review the actions of the executive branch. And when we talk about the executive branch, we're not just talking about the president, we are talking about the bureaucracy as well. For example, currently you are seeing a debate that is happening about the post office and their ability to to return mail in a timely manner, especially with the election coming up. The Congress has had hearings where they have brought in people from the post office, and they have also kind of questioned them on the process of the post office, the funding of the post office, the needs of the post office, and making sure that the things are running smoothly in the post office. That is oversight. They can check on the activity of a specific group within the federal bureaucracy, so they can check in and see what was going on, why something is not getting done, how is the money being spent. Basically, it's as if they're a parent who has given, let's say, $50 to you, and then coming back and saying, where'd that $50 go? What did you spend it on? Where did you go with your friends? Whatever. That's kind of the job of Congress. A very famous way or famous example of the functions of Congress and oversight was the 9/11 Commission. After 9/11 happened, there was a joining together of the House and the Senate, and they came together and investigated all aspects of 9/11. You can actually read the commission report, but basically they looked at how the airline and air traffic control and all that stuff failed. They looked at how the FAA failed. They looked at how the TSA failed. They looked at how the FBI failed. They looked at how the CIA failed. They looked at how the Department of Justice failed. And they put all of this together, and they said, this is what happened that caused 9/11. And that report is located right here in the PowerPoint. And if you want that, I can definitely get that to you. But that's just one example. Another example that I always talk about is there was a issue of steroids in baseball and a question of illegal gambling or whatever. Well, some of those baseball players, Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, who's the other one? Rafael Palmeiro, those guys, Sammy Sosa, they actually testified in front of Congress over that very issue in a hearing. So they were providing some oversight there. A third thing that they can do is they can kind of provide some education on issues. They can speak out on things that are happening. Certain senators are very good at speaking out to things that they are passionate about. For example, Marco Rubio, being from Florida, dealing with a high percentage of Cuban Americans, speaks out a lot against the issues that are going on in Cuba from his perspective, and discusses the scenario in Cuba based on his interpretation of the events and the effects on Cuban immigrants or Cuban Americans. A lot of that doesn't come out if Marco Rubio doesn't do that. You also have some House members. I know John Lewis was one. He just recently passed away, but as a member of the House of Representatives, he was a passionate opponent to President Trump, and he used his platform to try and educate on some of the actions that President Trump was being accused of during the impeachment trials. So they can also use their platform to educate on current issues, and then ultimately they can provide some sort of conflict resolution as well. The big two for functions of Congress to know are oversight and lawmaking, though. Those are the two that I think show up on the exam the most. Here's a list of enumerated powers. Remember, enumerated means that these are specifically stated within the Constitution. And I'm not going to go through these very much. We will talk about them, but this is just something to make sure that you do write down. So if you want to pause this video and write that down, that would be important too. Through the amendments, Congress has increased their powers. They certify presidential elections. I believe that is I want to say the 11th or 12th amendment. I could be wrong on that. They levy an income tax. That was the 16th amendment. They determine if an acting president in cases of death or incapacity. That is the 25th amendment. And they actually established the process of presidential succession. And then also they have the power to enforce in some cases based on tradition and some actions that have been taken before. But most of the time, like I said, the powers and functions are going to come down to oversight or lawmaking. We have discussed the necessary and proper clause, and this is a way that Congress has increased their authority over the other branches because of the vagueness of it. It has been a basis for the expansion of the national government. From things like education to things like the Federal Reserve System, and ultimately increasing the powers on their check of the president. The necessary and proper clause, being so vague, has allowed Congress to pass laws that have given them increased control over things that maybe were not designed in the Constitution. Just an example of that could be simply the War Powers Resolution, the ability of Congress to kind of overstep the president on foreign policy initiatives and stop a foreign policy initiative from happening based on their politics or whatever. So that was kind of done out of the idea that Congress has more powers than what are explicitly stated. The necessary and proper clause leads to what we call implied powers. So do know the difference between enumerated and implied powers and how the necessary and proper clause leads that or creates that. Finally, there are two other options, and these are more so, well, the first one is the Senate, and the second one is the House and the Senate. Um, Appointments and treaties, any appointment to a federal bureaucratic position, whether it be a secretary or a cabinet secretary, not a secretary, excuse me, a cabinet secretary, or to the head of the Federal Reserve or whatever, those are appointed by the president, but then ultimately approved by the Senate. And what you see here is a room that is like, let's say, the Senate Judiciary Committee room. And that committee this is where they hold their questions through the appointment process and see whether or not that person is qualified for that particular office. Appointments also go with the Supreme Court. So the Congress does have a say in who is on the Supreme Court as well. Treaties, they are responsible. The Senate is responsible for approving treaties. They obviously 60 vote, or not obviously, but a 60 vote approval, and they can sort of negotiate, but most of the negotiation goes into the hands of the president. And the final power that they have is the impeachment and removal from office, not just of the president. That's the one that we think of the most, but also of the legislative branch, or the judicial branch as well. I'm sorry. Remember, impeachment does not mean removal from office. Impeachment just means to be tried for a high crime or misdemeanor. Removal from office is actually done by the Senate. So the impeachment is done by the House, and all that says is there's enough charges or enough evidence to bring charges against the president and or some other official in the government. And then it goes to the Senate, and the Senate is responsible for voting whether or not that person needs to be removed from office. We have now had 3 presidents impeached, and none of them have been removed from office. So just understand that process, because impeachment does not mean removal from office. We have had impeachments. We have never had somebody removed from office. The last 2 slides that I'm going to talk about here are the formal leadership of Congress. And you do need to know these terms, and you kind of need to know their roles here throughout their jobs in Congress. First is the House of Representatives. In both the House and the Senate, the majority party is going to control the legislative process, and the majority party then picks the leadership within their own group. So it is not something that we get to vote on. It is the members of the House and the members of the Senate that are choosing who the speaker is, who the majority leader is, who the whips are, and who's going to fill those positions. So in the House of Representatives, you have 4 key leaders. The first is the Speaker of the House, and this person currently is Nancy Pelosi. The House is currently led by the Democratic Party, and she is the Speaker of the House. She is the most powerful person in the House of Representatives. She is not only picking the leaders of the committees, but she is also kind of controlling the debate on the floor and what bills are going to make it to the floor of the House of Representatives. So she is, in terms of the process of legislation, she is one of the most powerful people. Underneath the Speaker of the House, you have the majority leader. This is a person who is responsible for the majority party. So currently that is a Democrat. I'm not sure who that is off the top of my head, but the majority leader is responsible for kind of keeping people in line and kind of organizing the party around a specific vote. The minority leader does the same thing as the majority leader, except it's for the minority party. So currently that is a Republican, and I don't know who that is off the top of my head either. The minority leader, again, organizes the minority party, kind of solidifies everything that they are going to do. The whips, if you have ever seen House of Cards, the first season, Frank Underwood is a whip in the House of Representatives. What his job is, the easiest way to remember it, is to whip up votes. These people are responsible for kind of being the enforcers for the majority and the minority leader. They are in leadership, but their job is to ensure that the party members stay in line. They will go to people who are thinking about voting, and they will try and convince them that this is how they have to do it, or this is the way that they should vote. Typically, whips are going to work within a given party. So the Democratic whips are going to work with the Democrats, and the Republican whips are going to work with Republicans. But they can also cross over and try and get other members of the opposite party to support their bill or whatever that may be. So whips try to whip up votes when something is coming. The whips are the ones that are going to go and communicate when a bill is coming. Excuse me. The whips are going to go and try and communicate with the other members and try and make sure that everybody's in line to pass or deny a certain piece of legislation. Very similar in the House or in the Senate as in the House. The only difference is the Senate leadership relies more on the party than it does everything else. First, you have the vice president. The vice president is actually the most powerful person in the Senate in the fact that it is the only role that is outlined for the vice president in the Constitution. His job is to preside over the Senate. Obviously, the vice president's job has expanded over the last 2 centuries, and that person cannot necessarily be in the Senate every day. So we do have what's called a president pro tempore, and what that means is they act on behalf of the vice president when they are not there. The job of the vice president mainly is to cast a deciding vote if there ever is a 50-50 tie. The most powerful person in the Senate, though, is actually the majority leader, and currently that is Mitch McConnell, as you see pictured here on the right. Mitch McConnell is responsible for it's very similar to the Speaker of the House in the House, but basically he is responsible for the ease or difficulty in passing legislation. The minority leader, same thing, responsible for organizing the minority party in the House of or in the Senate, and both sides also have whips as well, and their job again is to whip up votes in the Senate. If you have any questions, that was a longer lecture. There's a lot of information there. I would encourage you to go back and look at certain portions to make sure that you have some of that information down. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. If not, hopefully you guys have a great day.